Hello friends, it's Dasha. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome to my 2024 DNFs. I'm a big proponent of not finishing books. I am selective with the books that I choose to not finish forever, but it does happen. And this year I had 5 of them. Last year I had none, which was very impressive. But in 2024, I did have 5 books that I chose to put down because I just knew that things were not working. And so we're gonna go through all of them in order. The very first book I DNF'd this year was A Brightness Long Ago by Guy Gabriel Kay. This is a historical fantasy, heavy on the historical, light on the fantasy. You are following a person who is involved or witnesses the death of someone that kind of changes his life. I do not fully remember what it was about because it was that forgettable. Listen, I picked this book up because Guy Gabriel Kay is a Canadian author, so he was being featured on some shelves at a bookstore, and I thought historical fantasy could be interesting, and it was set to be inspired by Renaissance era Italy, and I thought, yeah, obviously that sounds great, but the problem is it's so heavily historical where the only fantasy comes in from the fact that these people and these specific places didn't actually exist. But I realized very early on in this book that I would just rather read the history that this is inspired by. I just have absolutely no interest in this kind of dramatic reenactment of things that probably happened in the past. I think real life's pretty interesting, and I don't really feel the need to read a fake history of it, if that makes sense. There's a reason I don't even typically read historical fiction. I'm just not as interested in some kind of, like I said, dramatic reenactment of events that I could just read a history book about. So for that reason, this was not for me, and I've heard that he is this very prolific and very beloved author, but I just don't think I would even try any of his other stuff because I think this brand of historical fantasy doesn't work for me. I don't think there was anything particularly wrong with the writing or the characters. It was just not my style of book, like very much so. So the next book I DNF'd is Mort by Terry Pratchett. So this is a standalone-ish that's part of a larger universe known as the Discworld. And it's supposed to be these kind of satirical, humorous, absurdist fantasy novels, kind of making fun of human life and societies and the things that we do. And this one specifically was about Death, who is retiring and taking on an apprentice. And while the premise sounds fun, Terry Pratchett's just not for me, I think. For one, the way this was written kind of felt like it was almost a cozy fantasy, and I know that I don't like that. And while I don't think I'd love like humorous or absurdist fantasy, I still wanted to try it, but I think that not working for me, plus the fact that it was almost cozy, didn't work for me. It felt like it was supposed to be like comforting, and it was supposed to be really like funny and insightful, but it just didn't really work for me. I just found it kind of bland. There's also no chapters or sections or anything. It's just like one continuous stream of consciousness of text. No real plot, no real character work, and I understand that that is, you know, intentional. I'm not saying that that is bad, but I'm just saying that it's not for me. I don't really like the way it's structured. I don't really like the lack of character work in this. It's just not my type of fantasy. Terry Pratchett is beloved. Terry Pratchett is very well respected, and I understand that the Discworld series has a lot of impact, but I think it's a series that's just not what I look for in books. There is still 1 or 2 more that I would consider trying. I think Guards I've heard very good things about, and Going Postal. But at the end of the day, I think this genre of absurdist satirical fantasy is not for me. I don't know where my copy of the next book went. I definitely still have it somewhere, but it just disappeared on me. That is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I've complained about this book on my channel a little bit, but essentially this is a modern classic following a fictional family in a small town somewhere in Colombia, I believe, and just kind of following life and deaths and life events that happen to this family. And the writing in this was spectacular, was almost enough to make me continue the book. What made me fully like put the book down and just say I can't deal with this is the relationships that adult men were having with teenage girls and underage girls. That alone was like, I just don't want to continue reading about this, and it was enough where it was not something happening to the side, but it was one of our main characters, and I did not care to continue, with all due respect. I've said before that when it comes to anything with kids, especially in horror or things like this, I don't want to read about it. I'm very, very sensitive when it comes to kids being harmed in any way, and that includes relationships of a sexual nature with adults. It's just really weird to me. You know, there's a lot of arguments to be made about holding people from the past to modern standards, and I firsthand will say, obviously I read classics and I read fantasy that do not maybe stand up the best. I don't think this is a case of that. I think it's just a weird fixation based on what people have said about Marquez's other books. All that to say, I loved the writing. I could see the merit. I think also magical realism, not for me. Like, that's kind of the theme between a lot of these books on this list that are actually, funny enough, all fantasy. I just noticed that. Every single book I DNF'd this year was a fantasy. Clearly, I know what I like in fantasy, and these books did not just fall into that, and 100 Years of Solitude is no exception. I do not like magical realism. I find it just a bit too weird for my taste. The next book is a very popular one, and that is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is a gender-bent retelling of the rise of a Chinese emperor. I'm not sure who specifically. You are basically following a woman who, as a young girl, is told that her life will not amount to much, that she will not be destined for anything too fantastic, but her brother, on the other hand, is destined for greatness. Unfortunately, he dies, and so she decides to take his destiny for her own. And while I like that in theory, and I really liked the beginning of this book, I liked this kind of coming of age story of her going to the monastery to take her brother's place and becoming him, essentially, while also still navigating difficulties of being a young girl growing up. The next part of the book that I got to was a little bit dull. We opened it up with a few extra characters being introduced as POV characters, which I wasn't expecting, because the sounds of this was like, we're following this main character and it is her story and it is her rise to power, and it just I was not too impressed with the other POV characters in that I didn't really care to follow them. I found that it made the story into something I wasn't expecting it to be. Like I said, I thought coming of age, I thought rise to power, I thought character study. And I also weirdly, I don't know, I have a weird issue with a book being touted as feminist when the main character has to become a man to become great. Maybe that, you know, maybe something in that dynamic changes once she grows up or actually takes power, but there was something that felt a little weird about that to me reading this. So I don't know, for a few reasons this didn't work for me. The tonal shift didn't work. I didn't like the multiple POVs, and I just realized that I don't really want to like give this a low rating and finish it and live with it negatively in my mind when I could just put it down. I was buddy reading this with Robin, who also ended up putting it down, so I'm not alone in that, thank God. I am a bit more controversial with my last one, and that is Theft of Swords by Michael J. Sullivan. This is, again, another fantasy. This is a very, should be up my alley fantasy. It's a bit more typical. You follow two characters who are thieves who are hired to steal something, but they end up getting kind of framed for murder instead. And it sets off this quest that they go on. And the reason this didn't work for me is because these characters, right? Let me read you these 3 lines right back here, okay? To set the scene. They killed the king, they pinned it on 2 men, they chose poorly. When you hear that, you think that they chose poorly because these 2 guys are super badass and they'll make them regret it, and they're capable of anything, and they're like super advanced, crazy guys. I don't know, like you kind of get the impression that these guys are larger than life and that they're the wrong guys to mess with. Of the 200 pages I read of this, these guys didn't, like, yeah, you're introduced to them pulling off this big heist, but you don't see them do it. You get one of them retelling what happened. Then, when they get framed for killing the king and captured, it's not them who gets them out of that pickle. And then later on, there's another pickle they get into. It's not them that gets them out of that pickle. So I'm sitting here wondering, where are these 2 badass guys that are promised to me? They chose poorly where? These guys are not able to get themselves out of jams. They're just supposed to be these larger than life characters that people are so scared of. I also just found this so fast paced that I don't get any enjoyment out of the characters, and I'm definitely a character driven reader. Obviously, I love Robin Hobb, and her books are so deliciously slow because you get time with the characters. And while I don't think I'd mind a plot-focused fantasy. Like, I don't think I hate that in theory. My problem was, we got to these characters, and I'm like, okay, like, you know, it's plot heavy, but can I sink my teeth into these characters at all, at the very least, to enjoy watch them move through this plot? And I just kind of didn't. Everyone felt kind of generic. People didn't really speak like people speak. Between, you know, the prince, who was just kind of very personality-less, very white bread. Our two main characters, our two thieves, you know, the poor, they chose poorly, they picked on the wrong men. Kind of also bland, a little funny. They have like decent banter, but banter alone does not a good character make. I need flaws, I need some kind of characteristics. You know, the princess and the person who was against her, who was our bad guy, just so juvenile. There's something about this that just like fully did not work for me. I can see that this was self-published at first, and I am somewhat surprised that it was picked up traditionally, and I just was bored despite the horrifically fast pace. There was nothing unique about this. There was nothing that made me think, yes, I want to sit through 6 books, because technically this is 2 books. And there's 3 books in the series composed of 2 books each. So there's 6 books in this series, and I'm sitting here thinking, I don't know if I want to sit through that. With all due respect, I find it boring. I do have the first book in another series in this world, The Age of Myth. I think Robin had sent me that as a gift, and I will probably try it as well, see if maybe that works, because that one seemed to have involved gods, which is always a bit more my speed, but Theft of Swords was just not it. There's my slightly controversial list of books I DNF this year. Let me know where you stand on not finishing books if you're a fan, and if so, what did you not finish this year and why? I am horrifically nosy, as we all know. My social media is linked down below. You guys can always come talk to me there. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!